Thank you for coming here tonight to hear me. What I'd like to do to start this lecture is to go back 50 years ago to my first year at Oxford in 72, 73, when during dreary days in the winter, a group of students who were there together with me and I decided to go visit stately homes in the area. And we paid a visit to this one stately home, all of whom, by the way, had family galleries from the 17th and 18th centuries. And we went into the gallery of this one particularly stately home, and there was, among the family portraits in this gallery, the portrait of the most hideously ugly baby that I have ever seen in my life. And all of us were just overwhelmed by the sight of this ugly baby. And then when we went out to the gift shop afterwards, we went into the gift shop and thinking that we were just being silly graduate students at Oxford, we asked about postcards. And we opened our mouths and we said, "Excuse me, but do you have a postcard of..." And then the woman who was there at the shop said, "You want a postcard of the ugly baby, don't you?" She said, "Well, I'm sorry," but she said, "There is a big waiting list for the ugly baby postcard because everybody in the world wants the ugly baby postcard. So you put your name on and hopefully within the next couple of years you'll get the ugly baby postcard." Now, I mean, obviously this is a joke. People who wanted this ugly baby picture knew it was an ugly baby, and that's already a blessing. But the thing is that there is a problem with a desire for ugliness in modern Western society. H.L. Mencken wrote an article, which is a very amusing article, in the 1920s called "The Libido for the Ugly," in which he talks about the American desire for ugliness, which is already then something which is more serious. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the whole modern Western construction of a global empire of ugliness that is committed to a desire for ugliness, which is extremely important for us as Catholics. And there's 3 points I want to make in this talk today. One is that I want to start off by talking about the fact that intellectually and spiritually, the West is a civilization that wants to create a global empire of beauty. But there's been a turnaround in this, culminating in the creation of, quite frankly, the dung heap of our own day, which is something which is extremely important, not just for our Catholic faith, but for any kind of desire for a human life whatsoever. And then thirdly, I want to end with something which is a little bit different, which is why in the midst of this creation of a global empire of ugliness, I am a happier and more hopeful man than ever before. And this is something which might seem rather contradictory. Certainly my wife thinks it is. She always complains, she doesn't use the term, but she complains that I'm guilty of what St. Cyril of Alexandria called dipsukia, 2 souls. That I have one soul which is quite happy in revealing pitilessly all the horror of the age we live in, and then the other one which is rather flippant, so that I reduce her to tears when I talk about some of this stuff, and then sit there quite jollily with my gin and tonic going forward. So there's 3 parts to this lecture. Now the first one is the West as a civilization which intellectually and spiritually really is committed to preparation of a banquet of beauty on a global scale. And in talking about this, what I'm doing right now is I'm really presenting to you my own whole education, because my whole education, my whole career has been dedicated to talking about this stuff. And what I'm doing to you is not presenting something that popped out of my own head, but comes out of, and I want to mention the names of certain authors that, if you're interested in them, I can give you the names of later that you could write down. It comes out of the work of people like a man named Werner Jaeger, who wrote a massively important work on paideia, on Greek paideia, which is Greek education. Another one is Father Emil Mersch, whose work on the mystical body of Christ, in a work which is called The Whole Christ, which is a term taken from St. Augustine, which is hugely important for my understanding of things. Christopher Dawson's writings on the historical development of Christian civilization. And then also in terms of my own preparation aesthetically and then devotionally, Dietrich von Hildebrand. I'm going to bring up other writings as I go through here in order to indicate what it is that I'm talking about. But we're talking right now, the first of my three-part talk, on the West's preparation of a banquet of beauty on a global scale. Now, when we first encounter the Greeks, who are real founders in this regard, the Greeks, through their poetry, introduce us to what it is that's most important to their whole life, which is the hunt for possession of the beautiful. What it is that's beautiful. And the Greek poets develop from the time of Homer onwards in their discussion of what it is that they think is important for understanding what's beautiful and how to possess the beautiful. And they show us that it's something which can't be just an individual operation. It's something which is a social operation as well. It's an individual operation in a social environment that involves the work also of the community, of the state, of the polis, to use the Greek term. But in Greek history, in ways we just don't have that much time to be able to go into right now, there's a great crisis in the work of the Greek state in terms of the work of places like Athens and Sparta, which ended up going to war with one another after having been allies. And this caused a crisis. And in this crisis, what happens is that you develop the whole philosophical Socratic approach towards trying to understand what this whole question of the hunt for the beautiful is, what the beautiful is, what the possession of the beautiful is. And in their discussion of what this is all about, they very much indicate the fact that individual and social, sensual, immediate impressions of what it is that you need to do in order to understand what's beautiful and get possession of what's beautiful are deceptive. And as a result of that, you've got to step back and do some deeper investigation in this regard. And this is why Socrates, for example, goes about this operation very, very much impressed by what medical people are doing at the moment, because he's already got the medical work of Hippocrates and others to deal with. And Socrates and his followers, Plato and Aristotle and others, they see that medical people are aware that there's a difference between superficial symptoms and real causes of disease. And as a result, Socrates says this is what we have to do in talking about understanding what's beautiful and hunting for what's beautiful. We have to see if we have just symptom appreciations of what is at stake here, or whether there are deeper matters that we have to deal with. And as a result, he says that what's needed is soul doctoring. And soul doctoring requires a stepping back and a detour from just immediate reactions to what sensually tells us what we need to do in order to get what's beautiful, in order to understand what's really important here. And it's this whole detour that leads the Socratics to understand that to be able to grasp what's beautiful, we need to know what's good. And we also need to know what's true. Because when we just listen to what it is that we have sensually having an impact on us, what we're doing is we're really living like people who are half asleep. And we need to awake from slumber in this regard. And that means that we've got to step back and explore what it is that's good and true. Now, here you get a dilemma that Plato describes for us. And he describes for us in a number of writings his dilemma. He says, in order for the individual to be able to understand what's good and true, he needs the help of the community around him. But in order for the community to understand what's good and true, the community needs the help of the individual being awakened in this regard. And the problem is that both of them have difficulties. So that Plato says, for example, in the Laws, he says, I don't understand how we're going to deal, he doesn't use the term, but with this chicken and egg problem. The individual needs the community to know what's good and true, and the community needs the individual to be good and to be dedicated to the true, to help it. And he says this very telling phrase, he says, I don't see how we're going to deal with this dilemma unless some God comes to save us. And some God does come to save us, because every good and perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of lights, as St. James tells us. And we needed the help of the Creator and the Redeemer Word in order to be able to clarify this whole question of what's really beautiful and how you get possession of what's beautiful. And the coming of the Creator and the Redeemer Word tells us through Revelation that the creation we have around us is filled with beautiful things that were meant to be beautiful and were meant for us to be used to have possession of what's beautiful. And we have to accept that they were valuable and they're good, and they still are good, but they've been marred by sin, and therefore they need correction. And they need correction that will lead to their transformation, and the correction and transformation of the things that we sense around us are beautiful. The correction and transformation will help to awaken us from our slumber. Now, let me turn to another element in this regard to continue onwards here. And this is something which is perhaps a little flippant to begin with. But when you look at the Lives of the Caesars by Suetonius, the writer Suetonius, which is a very amusing work. If you can't fall asleep at night, I would read Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars. It's very amusing. And he describes for us the life of Claudius, who is known to be very much a friend of good eating and good drinking, and also rather lazy. The Emperor Claudius is asleep in the Senate, as he often was, snoring. And the senators began discussing a tax on restaurants in the forum. And Claudius heard this and awoke from his slumber and then said, "Gentlemen, how could anyone deny a human being a snack?" And what he's talking about is something, I think, which is valuable, because he recognizes that sitting down at table is very important for people to understand the world around him. And one person who understood this was Christ, because Christ teaches a great deal, tells a great deal, and then institutes the sacrament of the Eucharist in a banquet. Because of the fact that a banquet is something that introduces us to the whole splendor of the things of nature and of community enjoying the things of nature, of life, and of the theater of life in which it is that we are meant to live. And the whole story of creation is a love story. And a love story requires a wedding banquet. And a love story recognizes that the whole world is meant to be a theater put in front of us as a banquet to show us the beautiful life that we have, that has been given to us by God, which is meant to lead us from the banquet of life to an eternal banquet. The whole message of the Creator and Redeemer God is not a message just of truth in the terms of intellectual principles, but it also is truth that introduces us to a way and a life, and a beautiful way and life, and a beautiful way in life in which everything is in its proper place, in its hierarchy of value. And this is taught to us in what fashion? By a person, Christ, the Son of God, who is also a body that we have to become a member of in order to be able to live. So the ancient Greeks saw that in order to understand what's beautiful, the individual had to learn it within a body, the community, and now we learn through the incarnation that we have to learn this through the body of Christ. And through the body of Christ, which is something which is continued for us in the life of the church. So if you can follow what I'm getting at right now, we're still on this whole hunt for learning what it is that needs to be done and to be known in order for us to gain possession of what's beautiful, and now gain possession of what's beautiful eternally. And this is something which is going to, with the global spread of Christianity, be put on the worldwide level, so that we're going through the work of the missionaries from the 1400s onwards, learn that if we want to know what's beautiful, we have to recognize that all of the different cultures that we meet in the world that's been created by the good God have things to offer us that we have to consider and accept, but recognize are flawed by sin, and therefore correct by means of the revelation of Christ and the grace that comes through Christ in the mystical body, in order that all of it on the global level can help us to be able to prepare a banquet in front of us here on earth in a theater of beauty, which will open our eyes to the fact that there's something more that's meant for us, which is an eternal banquet of beauty. Now, there are pitfalls to all of this, because the world we live in is a divine comedy. And that divine comedy involves a recognition that there's been sin, and that there's hell, and that there are dangers that prevent us from being able, in a flippant way, to put all of this together in some proper fashion. There are some people who don't want soul doctoring, that reject soul doctoring, that reject the invitation to a banquet of beauty in creation, which is nevertheless flawed, and which has to be corrected and transformed through revelation and grace. But the people who are involved in rejecting this, who I'll get back to in more detail in a second, when the Christians come onto the scene, they end up going underground. And as a result, it's possible for the Christian world, working together with what came beforehand from the Greek and Roman world, and utilizing later what they encounter in the Chinese world and in other places, to set a banquet of beauty on the earth in front of everyone who becomes part of the mystical body of Christ, to help to urge us onwards to want the still greater banquet eternally with God. And you can trace the development of all of this historically. I mean, you can see how people like St. Bernard in the 1100s understands how there is this set of levels of different ways in which beauty is leading us onward towards understanding the need for the eternal beauty that can only come through revelation. There's ways in which later on, leaping far ahead past various problems we have to talk about, that in Baroque civilization, people who are involved in architecture understand that you have to build a theater of beauty in the world around us to lead people to understand that through the mystery and the confusions of life, there is this banquet of eternal beauty waiting for us. And in this regard, I always think of a place like Rome. If you've been to Rome and you've been in some of the older sections of Rome and you get lost in all of the welter of little streets that make it think that you're going nowhere, you pass through them, and then all of a sudden it opens up into the Piazza Navona. And then you've got this glory of beauty that's there that shows you that through the confusion even of the architecture of a city, you have something waiting more for you. But even more to that, and more to the point for our own lives today, and also the organization that has invited me here, I urge you, if you've never read it, to read Dietrich von Hildebrand's book on liturgy and personality. Because Dietrich von Hildebrand talks in here about how the Mass the traditional Mass, and not just the traditional Latin Mass, but all the traditional rites of the Church, are organized in a way that reflects an understanding of how you use all the natural beauty of the world in a proper hierarchy of value, in an ordered way to push you onwards to understanding the glory that has to come through understanding that there's a need for more that goes beyond all of this, that comes from the Mass and from the Eucharist. Now, that's part one of my talk here. Let me move on to part two. The fact that there is a global empire of ugliness that's built up to contrast and to destroy what it is that the whole Christian message, working with everything beautiful in nature that came before it and that it encounters on its missionary life, a missionary expedition through the world at large, is built up. And it's important, and one of the reasons why I wanted to stress this in talking to you today, it's important that you know that what we're dealing with today is not something that popped out of nowhere, it was just recent, but it is a long, long problem. It's rooted in the very nature of the opposition to truth and goodness and beauty, but which is very much clear in a special way from the 12th century onwards. And here I want to mention another book, which is extremely important to my own formation. It's a 5-volume work by a great scholar whose name is Georges de Lagarde. Unfortunately, this book has never been translated from the French. It's a book called The Birth of the Lay Spirit in the Declining Middle Age. And what Lagarde does in this book is he describes for us the civilization that has finally come to its culmination now. A civilization that's building a world of global ugliness in contrast to what we were building with the entire Christian vision, working with everything good that came from outside it as well. And I tried to describe this from the time this book left an impression on me. I tried to describe this building of a global world, an empire of ugliness, as the work of a grand coalition that works in favor of an uncorrected nature. In other words, a nature which does not recognize its flaws, an uncorrected natural status quo. And it was Georges de Lagarde in his work describing the development of this already from the 11th century onwards that made me realize that what he was describing was the development of what, to make the image, I think, more clear for us today, is a crime syndicate. It's a crime syndicate to dominate the world. Now, the reasons why this built up, starting from the 12th century onwards, something we can't really go into in detail here, except to say that it's because the success of what was being done by the Christian message was so clear by the time you got to the 1100s that the people who were opposed to it were enraged and began coming out of the closet much more in order to be able to fight against it. So what I'm developing is what I'm talking about is a crime syndicate that is now in charge in our world today, in the Western world today. All right, and I want to stress I'm taking this seriously. This is not just a kind of silly image, it's serious. Now, I would argue that there are 3 crime families with many subgroups composing this syndicate here. All right, so you can think of it as a mafioso image that I'm developing here. And one crime family are thinkers who are fostering criminal insanity through putting to sleep or trying to put people to sleep regarding the problems of nature and the need for its soul doctoring in order to be able to possess the beautiful. Now, there are various people who are involved in this project. There's some people who are the less guilty, but nevertheless part of the problem, are those who want to limit the number of tools that you need to use in order to be able to understand what's beautiful. And they aid the bigger danger. But the bigger danger comes from those people, and once again I'm talking about from the 1100s onwards, who are filled with contempt for any soul doctoring. Now why? Well, some of them are filled with contempt for soul doctoring because they see nature as evil and useless from the very get-go. And this involves the group of people that historically are known as Gnostics. People who argue that everything that has been created is the product, is the creation of an evil God. And therefore it's evil and useless to think you can do anything with nature around you. You can't make anything beautiful because it's all ugly. Then there are others who say you can't be involved in this project because nature, which was not evil to begin with, became evil and useless. And that's the Protestants. That's the Protestants. They don't believe God created an evil nature. They believe it became evil entirely with original sin. And then there are, in a different way, those who don't want any project of soul doctoring because they say nature is harmed by interference with nature because it's already good and therefore needs no correction. And that's what comes out of what is known as the Enlightenment and the so-called naturalism of the Enlightenment. And then among these these thinkers who are aiding the creation of what I call a criminal insanity, they develop, in effect, sects promising a happy land that will be developed either from escaping from nature entirely or diving unquestioningly into it. And interestingly enough, although they both start from different points, both of them talk about freedom as a means of explaining what they're about. You have to be free from nature, or you have to be free by diving into nature. And they seize this image of freedom from freedom as being a way that is going to lead you to the promised lands that they set up. And in this regard, and I'll come back to this in a minute, what you've got on the part of those people who are very much keen on saying that nature is wonderful in its own and is harmed by any interference with those who claim that you have to correct and transform it. In this regard, what's very important is what we call liberalism. The liberalism that is a product of the whole Anglo-American historical experience and has, as a philosopher, John Locke is its most famous exponent, which in many ways also engenders much more radical forms of trying to develop freedom than the liberalism of the Anglo-American experience would indicate. And then also in this regard, I'll return to this a little bit later on, there is the freedom that is called for by diving into nature from people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in this regard also we have to add the freedom and the wonder that's going to come from the arguments of people who are concerned with observing and experimenting with nature in a scientific way based upon the arguments of people like Francis Bacon. And we'll talk about all of this more in some detail later on, because the people who are very keen on making sure that people dive into nature in an observing and experimenting scientific way have got an understanding of things which is quite esoteric, and which plays a major role in everything that is of importance in the modern world. And ironically, and here too, I don't think I have the time to be able to explain all the ins and outs of this. There's ways in which people who want to dive into nature and just unquestionably follow nature and not try to correct it in any way come up with these schemes and understandings of things which make you really fly away from nature as it really is in a fashion that sounds like something these people that I'm calling Gnostics are interested in. All right, but that's group one. That's crime family number one. Thinkers fostering what I call criminal insanity through putting nature to sleep about its problems as well as its real possibilities. The second crime family are criminals pure and simple. Sinners, pleased as punch with fallen nature and its libertine, power-hungry, riches-seeking possibilities as long as you follow along with its business as usual. And these criminals, pure and simple, are ready to deal with anything that gives them power to get what they want. Anything that gives them power and is successful in giving them power over what they want is attractive. And remember that I'm talking about this beginning already in the 1100s. And one very great Catholic political thinker in the 1100s who noticed this problem from the very beginning was a man whose name is John of Salisbury, who talked about the incredible power and influence that was already noticeable to him with money people and the use of money for getting whatever could gain power over things. Now, I have a friend of mine who always says he has a pet heresy. And his pet heresy is he's angry with Christ because he says he didn't do enough when he chased the money changers out of the temple, that he should have had a machine gun at his fingertips to get rid of these banksters. But what I'm arguing to you now is that there's an awareness already in the 1100s that money and banksters are a difficulty here, aiding criminal desires of all sorts. And this is something which is also going to be aided by what I just mentioned a minute ago, by people like Francis Bacon and their promotion of the need primarily for understanding life, of observing nature and experimenting with nature. Because Bacon, when he talks about what life is all about and what wisdom is all about, he says knowledge is for power. What you need when you're looking for knowledge is to gain power. Knowledge is not for knowing, loving, and serving God, but for gaining power. And everything that comes from following after Bacon is something which is steeped in this idea of gaining power over nature in a way that is going to aid these criminals, pure and simple. Now, the third criminal family are the word merchants. Now, what do I mean by word merchants? Well, these are the people who were engaged from the very beginning with the resistance to having any kind of soul doctoring. And they were engaged from the very beginning in the form of those people who we know of as sophists. We know of the sophists we know of the sophists from their own work, but we know of them in terms of an analysis of what they're all about in the way that I'm discussing it, through Plato more than anyone else. And we know that these sophists who were there as enemies of the Socratics in the ancient Greek world were absolutely horrified by the idea of soul doctoring, of stepping back from just simply responding to the immediate impressions that you had upon you from sense, that told you that sex and power and money were and fame were the things that were important in life. But these people recognized that there was a power to what it is that the Socratics, who were insistent upon this soul doctor, were doing. And as a result of that, they could not ignore them entirely. So what they decided to do was they decided they had to co-opt what they were doing. Now, what do I mean by co-opting? I mean that they said that these people claim that they're philosophers, they're lovers of wisdom. We have to show that we're the real philosophers, lovers of wisdom. And we, as the real philosophers, have to find the appropriate words that come from our tradition. The appropriate, if you want to use a modern terminology, narrative that comes from our tradition, so that we can create a good story showing that what's necessary is not to take this detour for soul doctoring and healing and looking for the good and the true, but showing that what really counts is just simply responding to immediate sensual experiences that tell us what really counts in life. And what these people then do is they very effectively go about trying to co-opt the hunt for the knowledge, for wisdom, to live life properly by using the words that they have at their disposal to show that the work that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are doing is a waste of time. And Plato in particular shows us that they have a very great ability in this regard, and that great ability is what I'm stressing here right now because it never changes. It never changes. It's the same thing that's utilized all the time. Plato says these people have a knack for playing on the immediate feelings of people to divert them away from what they really need for soul doctoring, to understand what's really needed in order to be able to get what's beautiful in life. And Plato uses an image which is unsurpassable. He uses a cooking imagery. He says they're like cooks who have a knack. And if you want to think what I'm talking about, just think of fast food. They are people who tell you what you need to get satisfied with fast food. You need salt and you need sugar. And it works. And the salt and the sugar is ingested by you and you die as a result of it. But it works. So that these people who want to avoid looking more deeply into things, they end up co-opting the argument about what's needed for knowledge and saying, no, it is what you really feel. It's the salt and the sugar, and not the stepping back to see all of the vegetables and other things that you need that will really give you the health, that will give you the life, that will be good. And all these people who tell you that you've got to back off and look for something deeper, they're preventing you from getting what really counts in life. They are losers. They are losers. They are real losers who are just steering you away from what counts. And here, I always, when I think about this thing, I always think about when I was teaching, started teaching, and at times thought I was really on a roll and getting somewhere with teaching. And I remember one class in particular, it was a night class, and if the students at day hated you, the ones at night hated you even more because they'd been working all day and they didn't want to hear all this stuff. And I remember I thought I was on a real roll talking to them about the true and the good and the beautiful. And this one guy stood up and said to me, "How much money do you make?" And I said, "Not much." And he looked at the rest of the class and laughed. And that was the end. He had the knack. He had the knack. And what happens, therefore, is that the word merchants have the knack for steering you away from doing what you need to do to really look more deeply at what counts. And if co-opting the search for wisdom and touting themselves off as the really wise men by being the ones who are capable of getting you what riches and fame and hunt for pleasure and the like will do, doesn't work. They try to deal with their enemies by silence or by mockery. By mockery. And again, here this loser argument is there in my my mind in this regard. And the ancient sophists were horrified by the Socratics, but the Christians are even worse because they managed to popularize this message of needing something deeper. They managed to popularize it. And also the Gnostics who want to flee from nature, ironically, they end up using a lot of the same methodology. They try to co-opt and silence and mock the opponents. Now, one other element here in this regard before we move further and bring this closer to our own time. When there were the religious wars, when there was the fight splitting Christians, and Catholics and Protestants and endless Protestants were fighting against one another, there was a kind of reaction that took place among many believers that said all this battling among Christians is not going to do any good. It's going to only aid the atheists. And as a result, what we have to do is not talk about ideas. We can't talk about doctrines. We can't talk about all of these disputes among Christians that divide us. And we have to focus on what we just simply share in common, which was still basic morality we share in common. And as a consequence, they said that in order to be able to defend Christianity in general, what we have to do is we just have to bring it down to a practical moral level. All right, so that all kinds of discussions about what really truth means and what goodness really mean, they have to be avoided because we really all know that already anyway. But we don't have to talk about the ideas as such. And here too, to introduce another book that's been hugely important for my understanding things. There's a book, it's a more recent book by a man whose name is Blanford Parker, called The Triumph of Augustan Poetics. And he talks about the way in which in the 1600s and in the 1700s, in the Anglo-American world, there develops, he calls it a formula of exclusion. And what he means by that is that you don't talk about anything. You don't talk about anything that could be of disruption to your daily life. So that you avoid all of the discussions of things that the Socratics and the original Christians thought were absolutely essential to understanding beauty and the like. All right, so this is all something that enters into the work of word merchants. Don't talk about doctrines. Don't talk about philosophy. Don't talk about all of these divisive things. Just keep it on the level that is what's normal. You know, what's normal in our day-to-day behavior. And if you're in a Christian world, you can say, we all know what's good anyway. We all go good doing. Well, in any case, we're still in this criminal family I'm calling the word merchants, right? Now, these people are of value to both of the other crime families. Why? Because the criminals, plain and simple, need to masquerade their crimes in a Christian world with a nice cover story. They need to have a cover story to explain why the crimes they want to commit are not really crimes. The criminally insane, they need to masquerade their need to seek building the world that they want to create, which they can't really create because an escape from nature or a dive into nature is not going to build the world which is good. Or is going to help us as human beings. And in order to build their insane world, they always historically need to rely on force. And in order to get the force that they need, they have to turn to the criminals. And they need a cover story to explain that their turning to the criminals is not really turning to the criminals and everything is still peachy keen. So that in the process, the criminals, plain and simple, become criminally insane themselves. And the criminally insane become criminals pure and simple. And the venal word merchants put all the tools uncovering the meaning of goodness and beauty that's necessary, goodness and truth, necessary for understanding what's beautiful. They put all of these tools to sleep so that they utilize their words to conduct, in effect, a war against the word, against the logos, the word that the Socratics are trying to uncover through philosophy and through revelation, we understand, through the word incarnate. So that what I'm arguing about, and this is what George de Lagarde is talking about in terms of what's happening bit by bit from the 1100s onwards, is that there is this movement to put to sleep the whole hunt for the beautiful, right? And build a world which is going to be reduced once again to the purely immediate level of what you think you know or what you feel or whatever in a way that is going to create our global kingdom of ugliness. Now, Lagarde, in his book, he shows how this develops from the 1100s onwards and how it works very much to drive from the picture entirely reliance on the message that comes from the communal authority of the church, which is the pillar of the whole system. The church is the pillar of the whole system. And if you get the church out of the whole picture, then what's going to happen is you're going to get everything that provides the strength for everything else in the world, that the church is able to mobilize and give the strength to be able to give confidence to work with its natural tools to help the message of the word. It's going to put all of that to sleep. So that Lagarde describes that. And then the Catholic revival that took place in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries provides a lot of the arguments that explain what happens afterwards, what happens after these initial centuries of the 1100s and 12 and 13 and 14 and 1500s. It describes what happens afterwards, and this is what was important for my own development. Now, when I say Catholic revival, it's because there was a shock to the whole system with the Protestant Reformation, but there was a fight against it with the Catholic Reformation. But then when the Enlightenment and Enlightenment naturalism came onto the scene, there was a new kind of disorientation in the Catholic world that felt that maybe what it had to do was take seriously some of the arguments, which were not really that good, that were really putting our understanding of nature to sleep again. And then in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there's a revival that understands that there's a need to fight against this, because this whole effort to put nature to sleep, especially now in this second stage where you're talking about the need to not worry about correcting nature because it can tell you everything that you need to know on its own steam without any kind of transformation. It recognized this was wrong, and this was leading to building up something which was going to be a disaster for all of us. Now, bear with me with this. I'm going to take a little bit more time with this, but I think we'll end this in a reasonable manner without spending the entire night here. But let me describe a bit of what it is that Catholic thinkers in the 19th and early 20th century understood about what was developing here to return us to a state where we were not in any way being awakened to what nature could offer, but what was wrong with nature and what had to be correct with nature. And let me just start out by noting again the whole question of liberalism. I mean, liberalism is an Anglo-American phenomenon. It's an Anglo-American phenomenon. It's tied up with the whole glorious revolution in England and then passed on here. And its chief thinker is John Locke. And John Locke says that there is nothing that you have to consider in nature except the individual. There's nothing that, nature is nothing except individuals. That's it. And what is it that these individuals have to go on, to understand what they're supposed to do in nature? They have nothing to go on except all of the bits of sensual experiences that they go through. As an Italian professor who comes to my program in Italy every year says, when he's asked what's wrong with the whole liberal position and John Locke's position, he says it reduces everything to the individual and then it destroys the individual. Everything is individual, no social influence on you whatsoever, and then you as an individual are nothing other than sensual experiences on you, and then your need to respond to these sensual experiences. Now, what that means, therefore, is that every individual builds his personality by responding to his immediate reactions to the sensual experiences on him. And what you've got there in Locke, therefore, is the total opening to building up your personality as a female, even if you're a male. It's all there from the very beginning, because you have no guides, naturally or supernaturally, to tell you what to do to build you as a human personality, other than what it is that you have as sensual experiences on you. And these sensual experiences, again, could be sensual experiences which are shaped by sin, by sinful experiences, by sinful influences, and by sinful reactions to them. And Locke tries to keep this under control by saying that, sensible men of property will know how to keep this under control, but everybody who could see what he was saying could understand that this really logically had a radical individualist development that was based, that was ingrained in it, that could go absolutely down any direction whatsoever. Now, Locke said that all of us, in order to be able to satisfy our sensual needs, need property. And it's not a surprise that people who were tied together with this whole vision were people who were tied together with the whole Francis Bacon scientific, technological development of nature around us, to see what you could do with nature to gain power over nature so that you could utilize it to gain property and then the ability to do whatever you wanted with that property. Now, that's one side of this picture that is developed in terms of just simply saying that nature is wonderful and you just have to dive into it and just submit to its experiences. But another one is what comes from Rousseau. Now, here too, I'm just throwing these things at you, without being able to develop them as much as I would like to. But Rousseau is another man who argues that what is necessary in order to be able to understand what's needed for developing the beautiful is to just dive completely into nature. And for Rousseau, it's diving completely into, once again, the sentiments that one feels in nature. And by sentiment, he doesn't mean just simply an initial sensual experience that says, I want a pizza tonight as opposed to a hamburger, but something which is really deeply gripping you in nature, guiding you by sentiment, your feeling. And Rousseau argues that the person that knows that he is responding to feeling is the person that knows that he is dealing with nature as nature wants him to deal with it, and as God, who is the creator of nature, wants you to deal with nature. And as a result, a person who submits to sentiment in this regard knows also that he is speaking not just for himself, but for all human beings, because all human beings who would submit to the message of nature would feel exactly the same as the person who is consciously and willingly doing this as a kind of pioneer experiment, because Rousseau says he is a pioneer in dealing with nature in this way, in a fashion that other people have not dealt with. So Rousseau says whoever responds fully to the feeling of nature knows that he speaks for all humanity. Knows that he speaks for all humanity. And as a consequence of that, the person who feels fully that he is the voice of nature is the prophet who speaks for everyone and can have everyone be guided by him. Now, this is interesting. The reason why I'm developing this a bit more before I go into the last bits of my talk today is because if you argue this, think of what this means for love and for beauty and for the understanding of love and beauty in general. Rousseau says that the person who is virtuous is the person who follows the commands of the feelings of nature. So it's not a question of there being an objective virtue of what's right or wrong. It's a question of whether you are doing what you're doing on the basis of responding to what you feel is right or wrong. And this is something he develops in his book called The Confessions. It's a whole new vision of virtue. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to give a silly example of this, but it's not a question of whether or not you throw your grandmother out of the window. That's the determinant of whether it's right or wrong. It's a question of the sentiment behind it. But what's really important for my argument here right now is that what does this mean for developing a sense of beauty and of love in the world around you? Well, in his book on education, the child who is to be educated has to be opened to understanding what it is that feeling is and how to respond to feeling. But the child has to respond to the feeling that is guided by the person who is really first and foremost experienced what feeling is all about. Because if you've got a child under your care who says, well, I feel as though I ought to do X, Y, and Z, that involves book learning and not what you're talking to me about, it's proof that that child has not been fully awakened to feeling, because you're the one who's been awakened to the feeling. And therefore you have the desire, you have the need dictatorially to guide that child to understand what true feeling is all about. Now, he also writes a love story, Rousseau, called the Nouvelle Héloïse. And what happens in this love story now, and love again is about beauty and awakening to beauty in general as a whole, the normal love story is that you are confronted with something which is totally different from you, and you are shocked by it. And as a result, you don't feel worthy of being able to deal with it, and then you have to change yourself to fit to this other thing that has awakened you to beauty and love, but not for Rousseau, because for Rousseau, he is the one who's been awakened to beauty and love, because he's the one who's tied in with the sentiment of nature. And as a result, the loved one has to be someone that mirrors himself. And he says this outrightly. He says, the loved creature and the beauty in the loved creature is a beauty and a love that mirrors what's in you. And he says, if I do not see myself in the beloved creature and the beautiful creature, then that creature can be torn together by wild dogs, and it would mean nothing to me. It would mean nothing to me. So you've turned everything inward to you as the individual, and you building your personality, and you feeling, and then understanding everything else on that basis. All right, okay, we're getting here without too much. Now let me go back to my thinkers, my Catholic thinkers, because I think this is important to bring this to a conclusion here. My Catholic thinkers of the 19th century, seeing the beauty of the original vision and hunt for understanding what's needed to be able to go to the eternal banquet of beauty, and what's been taking place ripping you away from it, are aware there's a problem here. And I'm quoting one great counter-revolutionary Catholic writer from 1850, and writing here. He says, starting with the word "I am free" and their newfound spirit of independence, men began to believe in the infallibility of whatever seemed natural to them, and then to call nature everything that is sickness and weakness, to want sickness and weakness to be encouraged instead of healed, to suppose that encouraging weakness and sickness makes men healthier and happier, to conclude finally that human nature, conceived of as sickness and weakness, possesses the means to render man and society blissful on earth, and this without faith and grace, authority, or supernatural feeling, since nature gives me the feeling that it must be. Feeling either in Locke's sense or feeling either in Rousseau's sense. And what this is going to do, therefore, is build the world around us, the theater of the world around us, what's supposed to be a banquet of beauty around us to lead us to understand the divine comedy and all the pitfalls and what we need to do to get to the eternal banquet of love. It's going to just drag us down to the flatness and drabness of what it is that is immediately available, that we then foist on the world around us, on everybody else, as being what's real and natural, and creating a world which is not going to lead us ultimately to God. Now, bear with me with these earlier thinkers from the 19th century. That 1850 was the passage I created to you right now, just to show you. And I'm doing this to show you that this is all what we've got now around us is been building up. It's been building up. Let me quote the French journalist Louis Veuillot, who writes again the same time period from the 1830s through the 1860s. Louis Veuillot says that, what's building up around us is a world which is going to be focused on individuals who look only at themselves in order to understand the world around them, and then look only at their own needs or their own desires and their own concerns for power in order to deal with the world around them, and they're going to just drag everything downwards to the most base level imaginable. Writing in his time period, he's confused as to exactly what the form this is going to take because it's so bizarre. It's built upon individual focus on emphasizing and overemphasizing individual freedom. And yet it's concerned for all kinds of power mechanisms and emphasizing dominating people, and then utilizing all the tools that will develop for dominating people around you. And in a very interesting article that he wrote in the middle of the 19th century, he talks about the fact that what's going to be built around us globally is an empire of the world, he calls it, the empire of the world. And here's how he describes the empire of the world. He says, the police will take care that one is amused, and that its reins never trouble the flesh. The administration will dispense the citizens of all care. It will fix his situation, his habitation, his vocation, his occupations. It will dress him and allot to him the quantity of air that he must breathe. It will have chosen for him his mother. It will choose him his temporary wife. It will raise his children. It will take care of him in his illnesses. It will bury and burn his body and dispose of his ashes in a record box with his name and his number. He's thinking here about a world built by prophetic figures like Rousseau, dictatorially creating a society which will do what they want, but which will nevertheless be influenced by all of these other power forces that are operating around you. There will not be any more different places or climates, nor any curiosity anywhere. Man will find everywhere the same temperature, the same customs, the same administrative rules, and infallibly the same police taking the same care of him. Everywhere the same language will be spoken. The ballerinas will everywhere dance the same ballet. The old diversity will be a memory of the old liberty, an outrage to the new equality. Everything will be done in the image of the main city of the empire of the world. So he's saying that all this talk about individuals and responding to individual needs and whatever are just going to end up with the strongest individuals, with the strongest sensual desires, dominating everybody else, and utilizing the technology that comes from the development of all these power forces in order to be able to get what they want. And this is again what you can see the 19th and 20th century full of developing. full of developing, starting off from a desire to return to a freedom from the controls of reason and faith and community authorities and all of the like, and just going back to relying on yourself. And yourself dived into nature here. You end up getting endless examples of this flattening, this reduction of everything to what is base and sensual, while you're still claiming that you're soaring with your spirit. And then in a world which is technologically getting more and more developed. And let me just give you a few more examples of this before we bring it to the final conclusion. I mean, in literature, you see this everywhere. You see literature with development of what's called realism and naturalism, only wanting to look at what the sensual has to teach you about what's beautiful. This is why, as David White, a great friend of mine who used to teach at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, said this is why when people read the Divine Comedy, they only read the Inferno now, because it's only hell that they can think of. Madame Bovary, when you think of Madame Bovary in the 19th century, Madame Bovary was censored by the intelligent French censors, not because of the lascivious, adulterous marital relationships, but because of the fact that it showed a world in which there was nothing that was to be hoped for any longer. It was all flat on this drab, natural level. In music, again, the development of tumultuous, unrealizable passion, unrealized dissonance, demons shredding tonality, barbaric hammering at power demands from the people who are producing the music and the like. I found, E. Michael Jones has got a book in which he recounts all sorts of examples of this stuff. This is a statement from one of the people producing 12-tone music, breaking down the old order of beautiful music. The new order is much more rigorous and unpleasant than the old one, but at least it is not God's order. It is the composer's order. It's my order that I'm forcing on you, this order of ugliness. Or the hammering of modern rock music, which also is celebrated in a kind of mystery religion. Mike Jones quotes Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue in this regard. The only thing I got from Hitler was the idea of the Nazi youth. I believe in the Motley Crue youth. The youth of today are the leaders of tomorrow. They're young. They can be brainwashed. Or architecture imposing individual power visions of what life should be like on the world around us. In terms of the modern obsession with functionality in architecture and the like. Modern architects, and I'm just quoting a number of them, complain about the blight of ornamentation, making things beautiful and not minimal. The home should be nothing other than a machine for living in. Le Corbusier talks about the need to facilitate the spirit of living as individuals in a mass home, requiring a revision of spiritual values. Schools and school housing are built in a way that reflects a world that has praised freedom, but which now builds only for mass people. This is a citation from a critic of modern school buildings. It is the paradox of modern education in stone. The more that education idealizes the students as Rousseauian innocence, the more the architect has to come up with prisons to contain the violence their theories unleash. MIT built a building based on the behavior pattern of an orangutan village. Deconstructionism in architecture is something which has been concerned for just simply destroying all kind of reason and higher feeling for architecture. Here, what's called House X of Eisenheim, the architectural company of Eisenheim, House X, which was built in 1975 in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, is interesting. House X, this is the company describing it, says is built on the fact that the center is nothing. It looks forward to a more incomplete structure rather than backward to a simple, stable structure. A critic said that architecture of the sort built by House X was a house torturing itself in public. All right, now this is where I want to bring this now to its conclusion. The world we live in now is perfectly described by that statement. The West today is ruled by this criminal syndicate of the criminally insane, the criminals pure and simple, the criminal word merchants in a global oligarchy, which is torturing its civilization to death in public. This is the culmination of all of this effort that Lagarde began to describe of returning to a slumber about what nature is all about. It is just simply doing everything needed to make people, to use Sister Lucy's terminology, diabolically disoriented about the world around them so that they see no vision of being able to reach an eternal banquet with God. Education in the world, built upon this whole kind of approach, has created a criminally insane elite dedicated to criminal power gains based upon the use of technology and based upon criminal word merchandising and the criminal skills needed managerially to be able to do whatever they need to do in whatever field that they work on. The late Dr. Thomas Molnar said that all of the different groupings in society around us today are like barbarian tribes invading the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, feeding off of whatever remains of church and state. It's just another term for what I'm calling criminal syndicates. And everybody who's trained in education is trained in this criminally insane, criminality pure and simple, criminal word merchandising in a way that makes them able to fit into whatever sphere in life they might be active in, including the church. Because the church, by caving in to what it is that the modern world taught through liberalism, and then also what comes out of the whole Rousseauian tradition, which it has done since the time of the Vatican Council, has simply opened itself up to this same sort of educational and elite training. And of course, what it's done in terms of its most precious gift is it's reduced the liturgy to responding to all of these kinds of forces as well. So that it is no longer the force that lifts us up to God, but which drags us down into everything which is flattening and drab and material and earthly and, quite frankly, also just simply schlock when you're dealing with what it is that we've got here in the Western world today. Now, all of this has come to its final culmination in the period since the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989. In ways which, again, I've gone far too long as it is already, in ways in which I can't be able to describe here, everything that has characterized the development of this criminal syndicate has been shown to be active in every sphere of life since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And somehow or other, this has all reached its final peak in a way that would require a great deal of time to be able to explain. Since the time of the Rio Conference in 1992 on sustainability. Now, when I first realized this, when I first heard of this, I didn't really it went in one ear and out the other. Because I learned about what was going on with this conference in Rio on sustainability through a Swiss organization of psychiatrists that was concerned about the fact that it was no longer being utilized in Zurich for dealing with drug problems. And they didn't understand why this was the case until they started to grasp the fact that the Zurich canton was now promoting drug use rather than fighting against it. And they began to see that there were all kinds of forces active in this that included government agencies, that included religious organizations, that included pharmaceutical companies, that included multinational companies, that included practically everything active in the modern world, and all of it in a commitment to really fighting against human life entirely and redefining the human person in a way that destroyed the human person, that made it impossible to be able to do anything that would build a life of truth or beauty that understood what the human person was all about. And all of these forces have gathered together and have found in a strange way an emporium with the World Economic Forum at Davos every year, and in a fashion which is linked together with their understanding of the use of technological developments to be able to control how human beings act and think in a fashion that gives them the sense that they're going to be able to build a world in which none of us are going to be eager to search for what the meaning of goodness and truth are all about ever again. If you've ever investigated what transhumanists talk about and posthumanists talk about, they are very active in all of these various organizations that meet together in places like Davos. They are convinced that we are reaching a point that they call the singularity, where nothing that has played any role in defining the true and the good and the beautiful in the past will have any significance in the future ever again. And they have got a massive control over practically every organ of life in church and state in our own time. All right, so now we're at the end. So why is it in the midst of all of this that I'm happier and more hopeful than ever before? Because this doesn't sound terribly happy and hopeful at all. Well, I mean, there are various reasons why I'm very happy and hopeful. For one thing, everything that I was taught predicted this. Everything that I taught was right in predicting this. And therefore, everything that I have been myself eager to be able to spread about, to tell other people the truth regarding, has been, I think, proven to be correct. And not only that, but I'm now free, having been thrown out of the university environment, to spread this around without having to worry about wasting my time in a university environment which is just as dedicated to the destruction of the human person as everything else. And not only that, but I'm able to do this among friendly people who often provide you food and drink. Dr. Mara, my predecessor as director of the Roman Forum, used to say when we went from one dinner after another that we would never have eaten as well as this if it hadn't been for Vatican II. So I'm happy and more hopeful for that reason, but I'm more seriously happier and hopeful because this means we were all right. The whole Christian view was right. The whole Western view was right. And not only that, but these people that we are fighting against, who have got a massive power and a massive sense in every other regard of being able to dominate everything now, are frightened of us. And you can see that in the way in which they're using all of their forces to spy on traditionalist Catholics and the like. They are frightened of us. And there is no honor among thieves. Because if this is a criminal syndicate, as I've been describing it, and there are historical examples of ways in which this criminal syndicate has worked together and broken up in the past, then they're not always going to be able to do everything that they want in the way in which they think that they want. All right, so that's another hopeful sign. And the way in which I want to end this, therefore, is on a comment which I think it's necessary for us to always keep in mind in order to be able to realize the hope that we still have to deal in a world that's globally committed to an ugliness which is now also focused on the destruction of the human person entirely. And that is that we have to avoid what Dietrich von Hildebrand called the unclassical sins. And the unclassical sins are not the 7 deadly sins, but they're the sins that have grown up in the modern world also with this meditation too much on the individual and what the individual is all about and what he thinks and thinks and thinks. And they involve the unnatural, nostalgic, melancholic, romantic sin of just dwelling on just how wretched our situation is right now. Now, when I say melancholy, I mean melancholy and nostalgia, I don't mean the mass. Because as I've tried to indicate here, the mass is part of the permanent, glorious, beautiful, ordered things that lead us to the eternal banquet of beauty. It's not that. It's a fear or a worry about, or perhaps I shouldn't say worry, but a warning that we not get nostalgic about a past that's gone and that we never had a part of. Because it's not something that we can work with. As one teacher of mine said, one of my great teachers said, remember this, all centuries have been pretty bad, but the 20th century and the 21st are worse. You know, that's true. It is worse, but they've all been bad. And all of the things that have been done that have been bad have been problems that have caused us difficulties in explaining why we have the hope that we have with the world, the civilization that we've grown up in. So what I want to do, and there are a few people here I know who have heard me on this theme before in the past, and I beg their forgiveness in my talking about it, but I love the German writer Ernst Jünger, who lived for 103 years and who converted to Catholicism when he was 99 years old. Because his whole life was leading to Catholicism and he didn't even realize it for a long, long time. And he has a book which is called On the Marble Cliffs that he wrote in 1939. And it's an anti-Nazi book, but it's an anti-modern book in general. And in this book he discusses a civilization which is a glorious, beautiful civilization. And it's collapsing. It's collapsing, and it's our civilization he's describing that's collapsing. And he says here that what do we have to do? Do we wallow in the nostalgia about what it was? No. First of all, you have to have courage. Because as he says, the more the panic grows, the more uplifting the image of a man who refuses to bow to the terror. And in the novel, there are these 2 brothers who are recognizing the collapse of the civilization and wondering what to do about it, and what they do to begin with is to go back to cultivate the beautiful. They go back to cultivate everything that's beautiful. In their case, they go right back to cultivating literally plants in nature. But what they're saying is that we have to cultivate the banquet of beauty, and it's all there. It's all there from the beginning. It's all there, available at our fingertips. Everything that this civilization has been produced, it's there. And we can start it with our own family banquet, or just eating together, and the Eucharistic banquet, which is what this organization is dedicated to do, which is more valuable than anything else for creating beauty and pulling people's minds upwards to the eternal banquet of life. Everything that we do to cultivate beauty is like throwing garlic in the face of demons, of the crime syndicate that we find around us. And then these 2 brothers find allies, because there are others who are not in the Catholic camp, but who are striving to be in the Catholic camp and don't necessarily even know it. Because we need these allies for the inevitable battle that we're going to be fighting with the criminal syndicate that very much is dominating us at the time. And we need it all. We need every bit of beauty that our past has given to us to awaken us to the path to the possession of eternal beauty. This is Advent. And the first lesson in Advent reminded us that it is now the hour for us to rise from sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we believed. Now, does that mean that it's the end? Well, quite well, it might be the end. I mean, if you're looking for fig trees and message from fig trees, what we're getting from the world around us pretty much indicates that, the criminal syndicate in charge is demonic in character. But that doesn't change anything that we have to do on a day-to-day basis, because it may be that there's a new birth waiting for us. Maybe. And this is where I don't know if my good friend, I was hoping that my good friend Suzanne Pearson would be here tonight, because Suzanne gave me something to think about some months ago, 6 months ago. She was in New York and she gave a talk about, because she works for the Emperor, the prayer league for the Blessed Emperor Karl, and she was talking about Zita, the Empress Zita, and when Charles died, and Zita said, I don't understand, because he'd been so well prepared for his job, and he didn't have the chance to do it. Well, I mean, her comment there left a great impression on me, because the Emperor Karl and his sacrifice and the beauty of his life is valuable to us now. It didn't seem like it meant anything when he died, but it's valuable to us now. And this whole tradition of beauty of the Greeks and what we developed and what was fought against now, it's all there. And even with the internet, it's at our fingertips all the time. It's all there for us. And we've got that available to us, and we can use that now. We can use that now. And there are all sorts of other things happening around us that can be utilized to develop the world of the banquet of beauty now, to fight against this global ugliness and hatred of humanity that's around us everywhere. Cardinal P, great 19th century French counter-revolutionary thinker, at a talk in Lourdes, he gave this, he said this. He said, they say the supernatural is finished. Well, look here. He's talking at Lourdes. Look here. The supernatural pours out, overflows, sweats from the sand and from the rock, spurts out from the source. It rolls along on the long folds of the living waves of a river of prayers or of chants and of light. It's all around us. It's all around us. And we might be able to still use this if this is not the end. Now, what I do think it is at the moment is the culmination of the entire development of the modern world. And it is demonic. And it is evil. And I think, quite frankly, that the next year is going to be a decisive year in terms of revealing how much the forces of ugliness and of evil and of lies are fighting against the forces of beauty and of goodness and of truth. And I think that this is going to be a year that's going to test all our courage in a very, very dramatic way. And in this regard, I think that some of us may actually suffer very, very seriously and maybe even be martyred in what's coming up, because the situation is very dramatic, very, very dramatic. And in this regard, I think what we have to do is we have to take our Mexican brethren, the Cristeros, as our models in this regard as we prepare for any battle we may have to fight. And we say this, that one of the Cristeros said to the people who were persecuting them: "You may kill our bodies, but our heirs will convert your children. They will pray for the help of the martyrs their own parents made, to pray for the repose of their souls." All right? We've got a lot of battle ahead of us, and we have a lot of battle that we have to build on a banquet of beauty. Viva Cristo Rey. Thank you. I'm sorry I took so long. I'm very sorry it took so long. If it's any consolation, I cut out half of it. Yes? Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't hear too well. Thank you. I couldn't hear that well. Could you repeat, basically?
Catherine was thanking you for expounding on this and saying that she appreciates that you came to share this with us and something here as well.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. You know, the thing is that I'm going to be 73 in January, you know, and I got involved in this movement when I was 19 years old. It was just when it just began, because Dietrich von Hildebrand founded the Roman Forum in 1968, and then we had our first meetings in New York, 1969, 1970. So I took part in it at that time, and I really feel now like I've gone through the whole thing, and it's such a joy to see that there's another generation and many generations that are coming up in an organization like this that are keeping this work going. And I feel at times like I have nothing new to say anymore, because I'm just repeating what I've learned over this whole time period. And now it's reached a point that I hope that by saying what I'm saying, it'll cover a multitude of sins, you know, for purgatory in the future, you know. But I feel like a real need to be able to pass on something which I don't think that many people have had access to, in terms of this whole set of arguments of the figures that I've mentioned here, in terms of, you know, writers and the like. So I'm really pleased any opportunity I've got to be able to talk about this stuff.
You see, in your experience was similar. Parallels. Saying, do you think of going back to like the 70s?
Right.
And 80s? And then you went through different pontificates here.
Right. Right.
Does it another reason for hope? Do you see there's a lot going on? I think, you know, under the surface, it's a larger, in a way, is it not a larger base now than what you were having, you know, say in the 70s and things that
Right.
fallen apart, even though, you know, that didn't happen without the weakening in all the decades before that and all the other things.
Right. Well, you know, the thing is that Francis is the representative of the entire Rousseauian side of the revolutionary influence. Let me just step back 1 minute again. At the council, what happened was that, through the influence of people like Jacques Maritain and John Courtney Murray and others, what they did is they pressed on the church basically the liberal Anglo-American Lockean religious liberty scheme of things, which was part of the whole approach of the liberal movement, which on the surface made it seem like it was religion friendly because it was going to allow everybody the liberty to go about their business without worries, but which in practice, what it did was it destroys social authority, and in the destruction of social authority allows for the imposition of whatever the strongest wills are in parishes, in countries, in whatever the place might be, so that what happened is then the church then dissolved into this sort of representation of endless versions of modern naturalist materialism. And one of the versions that won out as well was the version that was promoted by Rousseau. And Rousseau's vision of basing yourself on feeling that was discerned by prophets, that entered into the Catholic Church in the 19th century through the French figure, the Abbé de Lamennais. Lamennais said that, in effect, that the message of the Holy Spirit comes through the people and through the obvious vitality of the people, except that it's always the case, given the fact that the people from Rousseau onwards are dumb and slumbering. They need prophets to be able to awaken them, so that there was always the need for the prophet to awaken it. And that's now transmitted through various other stages in Francis with this whole synodality business. The idea is that it's the Spirit speaking through the people, but you need those to discern what the people are speaking, are thinking. And the discerners are the prophets, and the prophets are the power, the forces that simply use their power, like this dictator pope, to use Henry Sayre's description of him, to indicate what the people want. So what makes me hopeful is simply that it's so much more open now, and so much more obviously anti-Catholic and a fraud, that it's better than it was beforehand. Because when this whole business started in the 60s and the 70s, or when it became, when it came out of the closet, so to speak, because it was already operating clearly under the scene, but when it came out, it was much more confusing to people. It was much more confusing as to what was going on. And now, after all this time, it's just much, much more clear. And I prefer the clarity. I prefer operating with the clarity of the situation. And it is very striking how not just, let's say, modernist forces within the church, but every force has honed in on the Catholic Church in general, and then the traditionalist elements within the Catholic Church as the real problem. And it's everywhere, it's everywhere. The other hopeful thing I see is that the population is generally so baffled and so befuddled. I mean, and that's not so hopeful because it's still so generally befuddled. My latest example of this was just a few months ago. I've been away in Europe for a while, but it was still nice, the weather in October in New York. And I always sit in front of my apartment with a gin and tonic in the evening before I have a dinner. And there was a couple that was standing before me in a panic while I was sitting there having my drink. And I asked them if I could help them. And they looked at me and they looked at their phones and they said, we have no data. So in other words, they could not operate without instruction from the outside. And this is one of the things I meant to mention in my talk, but didn't have the time to, which is very upsetting about the technology and the ability of the technology to control the population in a way which it's never been able to do before. There was a very frightening study that was done by scientists from Harvard and from the Sorbonne that was published a couple of years ago and then popularized by a Spaniard that I know, about the way in which the technology that Davos serves as an emporium for selling and using for everything from political to advertising purposes is a technology which is an infinitely more effective version of what Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century came up with for prison reform, with what he called the panopticon. And the panopticon was a prison system where everybody who were the prisoners could not see who was controlling the prison at the center, that was sending out signals for punishment and for reward that the prisoners would respond to. And these Sorbonne and Harvard researchers said that the technology used by everything from the Chinese Communist Party to pharmaceutical companies to multinationals of all sorts and to the media is the technology of the panopticon, except much more effective because through everything from drugs given from children in schools to just calculating the data from your responses on cell phones and internets, gives people, as one media guy said, the ability of the person who understands the computer, a better knowledge of the husband than the wife has, or the wife of the husband. So that the control is very, very strong. But I mean, that's frightening. But on the other hand, what interested me and what I noticed in my sort of little cafe around the corner that I go to every day, and this is in Greenwich Village, in Manhattan, is that there were a lot of people who were aware that there's a problem and have no point of view. They don't have any way to even be able to describe anything. And what was interesting was that I've been sitting at this cafe for 43 years with my books, and they all know, the people who come in here, basically what I do. And they know I'm a Catholic, and they know that I have a point of view. And what was interesting since the close down period is that people been coming to me because I have a point of view, and they have no idea about even where to begin to pluck down the stakes of their tent that they're building up to protect themselves. Now, I mean, I don't consider myself any kind of guru, except insofar as I repeat what it is that I've got as the message from the faith. But I mean, in that regard, I have a responsibility, and that's hopeful, if people will listen. I don't know. You don't know, But in the meantime, it is what it is. Here we are. And like I said, I mean, my hat's off to this organization because you're doing yeoman work here with this. So, well, thank you. Thank you.